Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we are going to be doing a standalone video entitled John Dewey versus the Common Core. This video is a little bit different. It's on a subject in philosophy that we really haven't touched on at all on the channel, known as philosophy of education. I hope you enjoy. So, recently, the online magazine Aeon published an article entitled In Praise of Dewey by Nicholas Tampio, a philosophy professor. In the article, Tampio makes the claim that the Common Core standards are in opposition to Dewey's ideal of progressive education. Now, in this video, I will argue not only that Tampio's claim is incorrect, but that in fact, Dewey's philosophy supports the Common Core standards. This is going to be a little bit different from a lot of the videos that we've done in the past on the channel. It's on a different subject, but we're going to learn some new things here. So let's get started. To do this, first we'll look at Dewey's philosophy of education. Then we'll look at what the Common Core standards are and what they are not. Then I will offer objections to Tampio's claim that Dewey's philosophy is in opposition to the standards. Finally, I will offer an argument that Dewey would have actually supported the Common Core standards over previous state standards, or at least that his philosophy gives us a picture of something that would support the standards. So, first off, who was John Dewey? He was a significant pragmatist philosopher. Check out my video on pragmatism for more on some of the other significant pragmatist philosophers, such as William James and C.S. Peirce. He was one of the founders of functional psychology, and most important for this video, he was a champion of progressive education. It is important to note that he was not the creator of the Dewey Decimal System. Now, Dewey's philosophy of education is large and complicated, but we're going to try to summarize it into a few simple points. He was a big advocate of participation over observation. He believed that students should be more participatory in their learning. They should participate in what they're doing instead of just being passive observers. The students should be active in what is being taught. Education should teach us how to live instead of just give us content knowledge. We shouldn't be just focused on providing students with the content knowledge they need to walk into a particular job. We should also learn how to live and behave in a moral society and a democratic society. And finally, teachers should guide students and connect them to information, not tell them what they should learn. You might know this as kind of a theory of teachers being the guide on the side instead of the sage on the stage. We'll go into these points a little bit more in depth. So, participation over observation. Dewey advocated for a classroom where students participate in their own learning. He thought that we should not observe and passively absorb knowledge, but rather that we should learn by being active. By doing, we can practice being active citizens as well, instead of passively accepting government dictation. We also need to learn how to live instead of just gain content knowledge. According to Dewey, education is instrumental in social change and social reconstruction. We need to teach children how to challenge the social systems currently in place, not simply provide them with vocational skills so that they fall into line behind the rest of the factory. Our point is to not only create students who are effective and productive members of society, but students that can function in and question and attempt to justify the social systems that we have in place. And finally, teachers should guide students and connect them to the information that they're already interested in, not tell them exactly what they should learn. According to Dewey, the teacher should let the student's own interests guide them to the content to be taught, instead of the teacher deciding exactly what the student should learn. Students point the direction, the teacher connects those students to the content of interest. Now, Dewey did try to strike a balance here, because clearly we can't have students be completely in control of their education, in that many students might say, well, I want to learn how to play basketball all day. Go out and play basketball. The point here was that the students' own interests and own ideas should point the general direction, and then the teacher connects them to the content closest to or most related to that general direction or idea that the students are moving in. Now, that we have a little bit of a very basic understanding of some of Dewey's ideas in the philosophy of education, let's look at the Common Core standards. So, for anyone that does not know or is not aware, the Common Core standards are a set of American national education standards for K through 12 math and English that various states in the United States were pressured to adopt in place of state standards. Standards of some kind always existed in education. The Common Core standards were just a set of standards that were created and states have been pressured to adopt. There's an important distinction here to be made between standards and curriculum. So when we say standards in education, we mean a very general goal that we want our students to reach. A curriculum is the way we want to reach those standards. The curriculum is the specific teaching methods, the specific content or manner in which these things are taught. The standard is the eventual goal, the thing that the student will do at the end of all of that curriculum. Standards are the skills that we want our students to acquire. The curriculum is the way and the specific content in which those skills are acquired, that we use to help our students acquire those skills. The Common Core standards, importantly, are not a curriculum. They are nothing but a set of standards, a set of goals. The Common Core does not tell teachers how to teach. It does not tell you the teaching methods you have to use. It does not tell teachers which books, articles, or curriculum to teach or what methods to use, with a few notable exceptions that we'll get to later. There's not a specific book list paired with the Common Core standards. They do not either require or prohibit testing. The Common Core standards, while they are used in the creation of tests, are not something on their own which requires tests to be given. And they do not dictate any policy regarding school funding. There are a lot of other policies that have been created around the Common Core standards, which say we're going to use these standards for high-stakes testing in schools, that testing is then going to be tied to schools' funding, or teachers' pay, or teachers being evaluated, hired, and fired, and so on. But that's not the standards themselves. The standards are merely the measuring stick we use. What the Common Core standards do is they provide a list of general skills that students should be able to accomplish when they finish particular grades, in particular domains or subject areas. So now, one thing that's often talked about when talking about the Common Core standards is a mile wide and an inch deep versus an inch wide and a mile deep. The Common Core standards claim to be the second one. They claim to be an inch wide and a mile deep. And they claim to be replacing a lot of standards, particularly in mathematics, which were a mile wide and an inch deep. Now, what does that mean? To get a better understanding of this education distinction, let's take a look at Bloom's taxonomy. So, imagine that we are learning about poetry. I have a number of different objectives that I could have for my students. Now, Bloom's taxonomy is not the only version of this. You have web and depth of knowledge and different versions of Bloom's taxonomy. We're just going to look at one basic one to get the basic idea. I could have my students memorize the definition of a poem. I could have them describe what a poem is in their own words. I could have them teach someone else the definition of a poem. I could have them break a poem down into its constituent parts. I could have them write their own poem, or I could have them judge if a poem is well written and explain why. Each of these different objectives is considered a level higher than the last one on Bloom's taxonomy. So there are 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. There's some debate as to their order, or if there are actually 6 levels, or if there are 4, but that's a subject for another video. Like I said, we're getting the basics here. We have knowledge, something like memorize the definition. Comprehension, describe that definition in your own words. Application, teaching someone else what a poem is, or applying the idea of poem to something outside of what you're already doing. Analysis, breaking something down into its constituent parts. synthesis, writing your own poem, and finally, evaluation, judging if a poem is well written and giving justificatory reasons for why you think that poem is well written. Now, generally, there's a conception that you need to build up through the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy to reach the top. You have to have some idea of what a poem is before you can write a poem. You have to be able to describe what a poem is in your own words before you can judge if a poem is well written and explain why. And you have to be able to understand the different constituent parts before you would get to those higher levels. Hopefully that makes sense. There's clearly some exceptions. You may not need to understand all the definitions of all the words in a poem to give reasons that, or all of the parts of a poem to give reasons that it's a good or a bad poem, but basically this is the idea. You need to build up from the bottom. Generally, when you say that a set of standards is an inch deep and a mile wide, that means it covers a wide range of topics, but only touches on those top levels of Bloom's taxonomy, or bottom levels, depending on how you're looking at it. It only touches on that memorize and maybe describe level of Bloom's taxonomy. We might, in a curriculum or set of standards that is a mile wide and inch deep, learn the definitions of simile, metaphor, alliteration, assonance, rhyme, symbolism, imagery, allusion, epigraph, foreshadowing, and personification. We might learn those definitions, maybe be able to describe them in our own words. Get through maybe the first couple of levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but because we have so many different concepts to cover, we only touch on those first two levels. A set of standards, on the other hand, that's a mile deep and an inch wide, would cover one particular topic at all levels of Bloom's taxonomy. We would learn the definition of a metaphor, how to state it in our own words, how to maybe act out a metaphor, that's kind of the application stage, the constituent parts of a metaphor, what makes it up, how to make our own metaphor, and how to analyze whether a particular metaphor that we see in literature is well made or not. These are two different approaches to learning literary devices. In one, you learn a lot of literary devices at just a couple basic levels, and in the other, you learn one literary device at all of the levels, or at more deep levels. The Common Core standards often replace standards that were a mile wide and an inch deep, particularly in mathematics, with standards that were an inch wide and a mile deep. They did more of those higher level objectives, or they required teachers to do more of those higher level objectives in their classroom. They've in fact received criticism for not including enough rote memorization and focusing too much on the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, particularly in math, where a lot of people conceive of what you need to do in math is just memorize times tables. With these distinctions in hand, let's turn to Tampio's argument. Tampio claims that Dewey would oppose national standards because he was an advocate of students choosing their own path of education, not simply having their education dictated to them. By standardizing education, we get rid of that individuality. We get rid of the possibility for individual choice or creativity on the part of the teacher or the student. One of Dewey's big ideas was that students choose their own path and teachers stand as a guide on the side. If the standards are forcing teachers to dictate exactly what a student learns, then they're going to be in opposition to Dewey's philosophy. I imagine that Tampio's argument might be formulated like this. Premise 1, Dewey argued that education should allow students to focus on what they are interested in. Premise 2, the Common Core requires that students focus on particular topics or subjects. Therefore, Dewey's ideals are in opposition to the Common Core. The Common Core tells us you have to focus on this specific subject, this specific standard. Whereas Dewey said we should allow students to focus on whatever they're interested in. So the Common Core is in opposition to Dewey's ideals. Tampio attempts to back up the second point with the claim that since the Common Core attempts to go a mile deep on a few concepts instead of an inch deep on a large number, students are not able to explore their real interests. He even quotes that phrase when disparaging the standards. At the heart of Tampio's argument is the idea that students should have the choice in their education, that they should have a well-rounded education that allows them to pursue their interests. instead of being pressured to only focus on a few standards. Tampio also makes the case that standardized tests based on these standards are very much in opposition to the principles of Dewey. Note that here I am not attempting to defend or refute this claim, or any of the other claims related to particular education policies that have been passed. My argument is that Dewey's philosophy is not in opposition to the standards of the Common Core, not the ways that some people have chosen to use them. Note that the Common Core standards could be used simply as a tool of analysis for teachers themselves to figure out where their students are, and does not necessarily include tests and the like. Now, it seems to me that the argument can be made not only that the standards are not in opposition to Dewey's philosophy, but that they are in fact supported by it. First, I will offer 3 objections to Tampio's claims specifically. Then I will offer my own 3 arguments that Dewey's philosophy in fact would be in favor of the standards for 6 cases against Tampio. Let's see. Number 1. All of my objections are going to center on the second premise and kind of a misunderstanding of what the Common Core does. That the Common Core limits the number of subjects that are covered by students. First, let's take this as the claim that codifying math and English standards prevent us from focusing as much on other subjects. Well, this might be an objection to the way that the standards are incentivized, perhaps money given to schools that pass tests that are only focused on Common Core standards, and because we only have Common Core standards for math and English, then we're focusing more on those subjects. Teachers' evaluations being tied to those standards, etc. But as I mentioned before, this is an objection to the policy of how the standards are used, not the standards themselves. If you're curious why I'm making this distinction, I'll explain it a little more at the end of the video. One could just as easily use the standards in a non-punitive way. The standards are separate from the manner in which they are implemented. There are ways that you could implement these standards such that they wouldn't have this conclusion. One could just as easily codify the standards for music, French, or woodworking, and then tie tests or grant money to those things and cause schools to focus on those subject areas. Simply codifying a set of standards for a subject doesn't force a school to focus only on those subjects. It is the larger picture of the education policy that we pass around those standards that causes the greater problem. Tampio does make that further point. What I'm doing is separating the standards from the policy passed around them. Perhaps then, if Tampio does want to continue on pressing the Common Core standards, he means that the standards force us to focus on particular topics within a particular subject, rather than allowing students free range in a subject. Math, for example. However, while a particular curriculum might do this, note that the standards are different from the curriculum. The standards do not. The standards are general enough that they allow for that choice of the teacher and, if that teacher wishes, the choice of the student. The math standards, for example, limit our mathematical investigation of mathematics to one of the following domains: counting and cardinality, operations algebraic thinking, number and operations in base 10, number and operations fractions, measurement and data, geometry, ratios and proportional relationships, the number system, expressions and equations, functions and statistics and probability. It seems that there's a lot of topics there. We don't seem to be limiting the number of topics we're covering. We're perhaps reducing the number of math facts that we memorize, but we're not reducing the number of general topics that we cover. Tampio equates standards which do not limit the way that one teaches with curriculum, which does. The Common Core standards are not a curriculum which forces teachers to teach in a particular way. They are a set of standards, and the teachers then themselves can mold whatever curriculum they want around those standards. Maybe, then, Tampio would claim that students should be allowed to pursue any of the topics at any time. The problem with this is that the standards limit when we can investigate them. In math, at least, standards really must build on each other. An understanding of addition is really required to have a good understanding of multiplication. Once you get to perhaps higher standards, there may be some more room for mixing and matching. But this is in turn represented in the standards and the way that they're laid out. and schools and teachers have some leeway with how they can apply certain domains to particular grades. Furthermore, any individual standard can be taught in connection with that individual student's particular interests. For example, you could teach this standard, analyze and solve pairs of simultaneous linear equations in several different ways, by creating a project comparing cost per minute of cell phone plans, just as easily as you could do it relating the slope and original height of two ballet dancers' legs, or the trajectory of two asteroids. Anything that has two lines going towards each other can be represented by solving a pair of simultaneous linear equations. The standard is general enough to allow for students' interests and perspectives to be incorporated. If a teacher chooses to not incorporate those, that's not a problem with the standard, but rather with the teacher's education and the teacher's particular curriculum. And it's so much so, it's so broad, that you could easily bring in the interests of students interested in astrophysics, dancing, and talking on their cell phones with just one math standard that we picked out. The point is that the standards do not dictate that a particular curriculum is followed. So there is still a huge range of ability for choice. But let's take a more confining standard, perhaps one of the most confining standards. Analyze multiple interpretations of a story, drama, or poem. For example, recorded or live production of a play, or recorded novel or poetry, evaluating how each version interprets the source text. Note, include at least one play by Shakespeare and one play by an American dramatist. This seems more limiting. Shakespeare is one particular author, and while he may have a wide collection of work, he only has so many plays, and someone might not be interested in Shakespeare. How are we then allowing a student to choose their own interests and simply being the guide on the side instead of picking something for them to study? Well, it might seem confining if the students aren't interested in Shakespeare, yet his works have been reinterpreted so many times, probably more times than anyone else in all of human history, that it would not be difficult to find a new interpretation of Romeo and Juliet for something, ranging from from gangs to farmers. This could be anything from an interpretation of Shakespeare by a popular sitcom, most of them have done it, to a YouTube video, for example. There are so many reinterpretations that it's possible to allow at least some degree of choice in the matter. If a student is very interested in that sitcom, or very interested in a particular YouTube channel, or is interested in a subject matter that Shakespeare has been reimagined to create, this would be a great way to do that. And in fact, if you look closely at the standard, it not only encourages but requires that you use multiple interpretations of a work. It asks and it pushes teachers to go out there and find different ways to understand a particular piece of literature. And while it could be possible that the teacher just chose to do it their own way, this opens up the door for students to also have the choice in their education to pursue a particular interpretation of that play, that poem, or that story. The possibility for choice and variety is in fact written into the standard itself. Now, objection number 2. Tampio backs up his claim that the Common Core focuses on a small range of topics by appealing to the slogan that we've been talking about a lot, that the standards focus on information a mile deep and an inch wide. This might seem to be true. Remembering our explanation of depth of knowledge, giving students a lot of content at a very shallow level seems to let them have more of a hand in their learning because they have a wider choice of things to choose from. If you only pick one thing that you're going to focus on, students don't seem to have much of a hand in their education. Yet, I would argue that this line of reasoning misunderstands exactly what is meant by depth of knowledge. When you give students the opportunity to create something of their own, or offer their own opinions on a topic. Note, those are the 2 highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and so the 2 last things that you would get to, and if you were only doing a shallow curriculum, would not reach. You make them a partner in their own learning. You do exactly what Dewey wanted. When instead, you simply offer them prescribed definitions of words and have them, the only creative part of it is to restate those in their own words, and then you have to move on to the next definition because you can't go any deeper on that topic. They become spectators to that learning. They become observers and are really given no choice. Many low-level objectives can only do the latter, while higher-level objectives may also do the former, in addition to giving some prescription of definitions. The point is that until we go a mile deep, we can't have that student participation. While when we're covering things a mile across, we don't have the opportunity to dig down deep enough such that the students get a chance to participate. The mistake that Tampio makes is confusing coverage with choice. A student does not have choice if a teacher tries to cover so many different topics that the student cannot take control over any of them. However, if a teacher covers one topic in depth, that student will be given the opportunity to make that topic their own by creating or synthesizing their understanding of it. Depth creates choice. Width requires rote memory. Dewey was in support of student choice. And if you're talking about literary devices, it might seem that a student probably doesn't have a particular preference to simile over metaphor, so providing them with coverage of that content isn't going to give them something they can identify with. But if you allow them to create their own metaphors, they can make metaphors about whatever they want, and therefore connect it with their own experience and actually give them that choice that Dewey was looking for. Which curriculum do you think allows for more student choice? One where every day the students learn the definition of a new kind of poem and they're given a wide breadth of options of poetry, or one where students study haikus, learn the parts of them, and eventually write their own? The first may cover more topics, but it makes the students passive learners. They don't get to do anything. They don't get to bring their own creativity or interest to the table. The second covers only one topic, but allows the students to be active participants in their learning and write poetry about what they want. It seems strange that someone would prefer an Italian sonnet to an English sonnet, but it does make sense that someone might prefer writing a sonnet about basketball to writing a sonnet about ballet. Objection number 3. Finally, this depth in place of width of learning allows for a more student-focused classroom. In the last, we were talking about student choice. In this objection, we're going to talk about the particular activities that are done in a classroom. When teachers need to cover many different topics, they cannot take time to allow for in-depth interactive activities. When their objectives dictate that students can only accomplish them by tasks with a multiple choice question that you can test with a multiple choice question, it becomes difficult to make lessons truly creative or student driven. If my only question is, can you regurgitate back to me the definition of all of these literary devices, or the answers to a bunch of rote memory math problems, creativity is very difficult to allow for in such a classroom. The more low-level objectives you have, the more teacher input is required. The more teacher telling a student, this is the way it is, this is the way it is, this is the way it is. The more high-level objectives you have, the more student input is required. The more student creativity or opinions can be brought in. For example, if my objective is to have my students memorize the definitions of 100 words, most of the content is being provided by the teacher. I have to give them those 100 definitions. However, if my objective instead is for students to write a story using 20 new words, they are providing most of the content. Note, I still had to give them those low-level definitions to start. You still have to build up from those low-level objectives. You can't just bypass the low-level objectives completely, but having fewer of those low-level objectives allows you to have that greater depth of knowledge and understanding so that the student will actually use those new words instead of simply memorizing their definitions. And by the student using those words, the student is doing more work. The student is more actively participating in the activities. The Common Core does not promote rote memorization. And in fact, that's one of the biggest criticisms of the Common Core, that there are not enough low-level objectives there. It promotes higher-level objectives. You cannot fulfill the objective, write a story, with multiple choice questions and regurgitation. You cannot fulfill the goal of students evaluating the work of another without providing them with the very critical thinking skills that Dewey champions. Standards which focus on higher level skills force teachers to include more interactive activities in their classrooms. It is, once again, not the standards but the tests which force teachers to focus more on test-taking skills than product creation and invention. What we need are ways to test the standards that go beyond tests, not new standards. We need to evaluate students by the products and the works that they create, not by their answers on a multiple choice test. We need to evaluate teachers by actually looking into their classrooms and seeing what goes on, not simply by the numbers on a set of scores. Finally, I'm going to offer, actually not two, we'll add in a third, 3 arguments for why John Dewey's philosophy would support the Common Core standards, for a total of not 5, but 6 arguments against Tampio's claims. First, Dewey wanted a school system that was not afraid to challenge the authority of the institution. Dewey wanted students who could think critically about social change and the presuppositions of our society. The skills of evaluating and judging are at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. If a teacher has to cover too many topics, then they will not be able to take the time with any particular topic to reach the highest level of understanding and teach these skills. The point is that if we have that inch deep and mile wide, we are not teaching students to question. We are not teaching students to challenge and hope to reconstruct society. We are teaching students to fall in lockstep and memorize things. If our act of education is to teach people how to behave in the real world, if we want them to behave like machines and follow rules and orders, we will have an inch deep and a mile wide. But if we want them to question and challenge and imagine new ways of thinking and create, then we need something that is an inch wide and a mile deep. In many states, though not all, the Common Core replaced standards which were a mile wide and an inch deep. The Common Core focuses on evaluation and judging, those top-tier pieces, more than these previous standards did. If Dewey was in support of education as a method of social reconstruction, as a method of active participation in democracy, he would be in support of standards which promote criticism of existing systems over rote memorization of what those systems want you to believe. Here's a more official argument. Premise 1, Dewey supported education as a vehicle for social change, or at least social participation. Higher level objectives teach the skills of evaluation and creation needed for social change and participation. The Common Core includes a greater focus on higher level objectives than many previous state standards. The Common Core, therefore, includes a greater focus on the skills needed for social change and participation. Therefore, Dewey's philosophy would at least support the Common Core over those predecessors, those state standards, which had a shallower focus and didn't focus as much on those higher level objectives which were needed for social change and participation. Argument number 2. This deals with the idea of student choice in education. If students are given the opportunities to create their own expressions and applications of content, then they have the choice in their education. They have the option to write articles about anything from basketball to foreign policy, so long as the article fulfills the objective of being persuasive. They have the choice of creating a graph representing C# or a supply and demand curve. Because they reach those higher level objectives, they do have more choice. They have more ability to bring their own interests into a math or an English classroom. Low-level standards do not allow for student creativity, even though they may cover a wider range of topics. Restating and explaining definitions or math facts not only do not require creativity, it does not allow for students to have any control over their own learning. Dewey was an advocate of students being more in control of their learning. It makes sense that he would have been an advocate of standards that allow for more student control. The Common Core replaced standards that have more focus on a higher number of lower objectives. Therefore, Dewey would have been an advocate of the Common Core. Once again, here's a more formal version of the argument. Dewey's philosophy was in support of students having more control of their learning. Higher level objectives allow students to have more control over their learning through synthesis and creation objectives. The Common Core standards emphasize these higher level objectives requiring synthesis and analysis. The Common Core standards, therefore, allow students to have more control over their learning. Therefore, Dewey's philosophy would have been in support of the Common Core, at least in comparison to other standards which don't focus so much on higher level objectives, which often the Common Core replace. My third argument, and this is the last one, relates to participatory learning. While the standards are not a curriculum, and therefore do not require that teachers teach the content in a particular way, they do require that teachers meet higher objectives, which require more student participation. Basically, while a good teacher can make lower level objectives like define simile or solve simple addition problems participatory, there is no way that a higher level objective like compose a poem or create your own math puzzle cannot be participatory. They must be in some way participatory. Higher level objectives require more of the student and therefore require learning to be exactly what Dewey envisioned, participatory. The student drives and the teacher guides them. The argument will follow the same form. Dewey's philosophy was in support of students being active participants in their learning. Higher level objectives require that students actively participate in their learning. The Common Core standards emphasize higher level objectives. Therefore, the Common Core standards emphasize objectives that require students to be actively participating in their learning. And so Dewey's philosophy would have been in support of the Common Core. Now, why does this all matter? Especially because I'm not disputing most of Tampio's claims. On most of his points around general education reform and this method of reform that's high-stakes testing driven and all of these problems that come out of it, why should this be set aside? Why am I defending so vehemently the Common Core standards as opposed to the practices around the Common Core standards? Aren't they close enough to each other that we don't really need to make that distinction? Why is it important that these standards be defended? So that we can effectively act against the things that are really problems in education, such as high-stakes testing. Many states actually wanted to adopt basically identical standards to the Common Core standards, but not call them the Common Core standards because there was so much controversy around them and because so many people equated them with that high-stakes testing. The Common Core is not the problem. It simply allowed for those high-stakes testing things to take place. What we need to do away with is so much pressure on teachers and students to focus on the tests and actually focus on the standards, which are relatively well crafted. Stop blaming a set of standards for policy choices which use those standards ineffectively. The point here is everyone that's advocating for the Common Core standards to be abolished is missing the point, and if they get their way, will not have solved the problem. The problem is the way that we are testing both students and teachers. But that's the subject of another video. That's not to say that there are not problems with the standards as well. One of the biggest criticisms that I've actually heard of the Common Core standards, particularly in math, is that they are too high level. Since there is less focus on memorization of times tables, students struggle more doing mental math at later ages. Problem though this may be, it surely is not something that Dewey would have a problem with. He was all for students finding out what they want to learn, not being forced to memorize facts that a teacher's picked out for them. It might be a question for Dewey's philosophy, and I would argue that Dewey actually tackled this in trying to find a balance of how much students' education should be teacher-driven and how much it should be student-driven. But it seems that one way or another, Dewey and the Common Core would be in the same boat. If it's an objection to one, it's an objection to both. I encourage you to read the Aeon article. Do you think that I did Tampio's argument justice? And if you think that I didn't, please explain to me what I could have done better. And finally, do you think that Dewey would have supported the Common Core? What are your thoughts? Have I convinced you, or are you in agreement with Tampio? Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.